and making change in Indian country. Today we have a very special guest, is Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin from the Cherokee Nation, who's joining us today to talk about today's Supreme Court ruling. It's the Oklahoma versus Castro, RTA. And Oklahoma asked the Supreme Court to return some criminal jurisdiction to the state after the 2020 McGirt majority decision that determined that much of the eastern part of the state of Oklahoma is still an Indian reservation. So welcome, Chief Hoskin. It's good to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me, Levi.
Yes. Chief, I'm going to ask the first question. What does today's ruling mean to Indian sovereignty overall? What impact does it have on sovereignty?
Well, it's not a good decision. I mean, I would encourage people certainly to read the whole decision, but look at the dissent. The dissent talks about the fact that in the 19th century, during the Samuel Worcester case, a famous case involving a non-Indian in Cherokee land who was imprisoned by the state of Georgia and went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said the state of Georgia laws had no effect on him and shouldn't have applied. The dissent said the court stood strong at that time, and today the court wilted. Well, today the court did wilt, and that's what we saw. And we hope that the damage can be contained. It is a narrow decision in the sense that it's about criminal jurisdiction of non-Indians on tribal lands. I don't want to, though, diminish the impact of just that narrow aspect of the decision, because it really upends a great deal of precedents. Again, it turns its back on what was really that bedrock principle laid down in the Cherokee cases in the 19th century. And it's something we're really going to have to analyze in Indian country, and we're going to have to make sure that future decisions are narrowly tailored and don't expand what I think was not a good decision today.
Yes. And that was a horrible decision. And joining us also today is Darren Thompson, and he is of the Lac-Du-Fable tribe out of Wisconsin. He's a reporter for Native News Online, and Darren has been covering this story this year. Darren, welcome. And do you have a question for Chief Hoskin?
Yeah, essentially, Chief, it's more of an opportunity for you to elaborate on the collaborations that the Cherokee Nation and other tribes have in place with the state of Oklahoma, particularly in regards to like state troopers or other county police.
Well, I think that's a really important question because the thing that's unchanged it really are two things. One is that McGirt is still intact insofar as it said that the United States must keep a promise to Indian country when it's embedded in a treaty. Congress certainly can try to erode that promise, but if it doesn't fully revoke it, it's still in full force and effect. That is true of the reservations that are affected by McGirt, including Cherokee Nation. But the other thing is the difficult work of day-to-day governing, particularly when it comes to criminal justice, involves working together. And that is true. It was true yesterday, and it's true today. It'll be true tomorrow. What has the Cherokee Nation been doing? Well, we have over 100 agreements with local authorities. So even though we have a governor in the state of Oklahoma who's the most anti-Indian governor in the history of the state, I'm talking about Kevin Stitt, and an attorney general who just lost his election, by the way, John O'Connor, the most anti-Indian attorney general in the history of the state, even though they have been coming at us and coming at the country with a great deal of rhetoric suggesting that it's chaos in the reservation. It's just not true. And the reason it's not true is in large measure because of those agreements that we have. We have cross-deputization agreements with all of these jurisdictions. And we also have some agreements that deal with things that don't capture headlines but are important, like processing traffic tickets. What does that mean? It means that whoever you are within our reservation, if you are suspected of committing a crime, for example, you could be apprehended by any of those law enforcement officers. Then we work out jurisdiction on the back end. That means public safety is seamless on the front end, but on the back end, tribal sovereignty or the respect for the various systems that are at play, the state, the feds, or the tribes, that can be respected, and that the cases can go along the jurisdictional lines that they should go along. So that's very much working. Today's decision does change that in a fairly narrow but important respect, and it has to do with non-Indian defendants committing those crimes or allegedly committing those crimes. And where do they go for justice or to be held accountable? Well, it was exclusively in the hands of the feds. except for domestic violence cases. We can even get more complex if we want to in this discussion. Now the state has concurrent jurisdiction. So you have the state of Oklahoma reaching into tribal lands with its jurisdiction over non-Indian defendants. But none of that takes away from the question you ask in terms of its importance, which is what have we done in terms of agreements with local law enforcement? We've done a great deal. Those are so important because it makes the difference between operating justice systems that can sometimes be at odds or have some tension, or systems that work together. We very much need to work together.
Yeah, I think that's really great that you're able to distinguish that one, that this only applies to non-tribal members on tribal lands, and also how, for example, current Governor Stitt is using this narrative in a very narrow-sighted viewpoint, in that tribes aren't willing to cooperate with the state, for example, when we're hearing with proof of, for example, what Cherokee Nation is doing with other jurisdictions to ensure that public safety continues. And speaking on public safety, do you think that this has more to do than public safety?
Well, it absolutely does. I mean, if public safety was the issue, a real analysis of what's going on with public safety would show that there's not chaos, there's not these huge gaps, there's not people being let out of prison or people being not held accountable. It's just not happening. Now, the governor has tried to paint that picture. In fact, even in his statement today, in which he does a little bit of spiking the football, he says, look, today we're finally safe, or something to that effect. Not an exact quote, but that was the sentiment, suggesting that in the hands of the Indians, we can't be safe because we couldn't possibly be trusted with administering systems of justice. Look, the truth of the matter is the most effective governments in the state of Oklahoma, it's not the state of Oklahoma, it's the tribal government. So whether it's healthcare or criminal justice, we're the best. And I think people understand that. So what's going on here is you have a governor who can't imagine a world in which tribes coexist with the state, can't imagine a world in which tribal sovereignty really has any role in what Kevin Stitt thinks is modern America. But the truth is, he's not thinking in modern ways. He's really thinking in a 19th century non-Indian mindset that tribes are a problem and problems ought to be just wiped away with the might of the government. The truth is, we're sovereign. The promises made are promises kept. He's going to have to live with that, even if he doesn't like it, notwithstanding that he got a win today. But what really motivates him is not public safety, in my opinion. What motivates him is he wants to crush tribal sovereignty because he doesn't see a place for it in his world. But unfortunately, we're here and we're not going away.
Well, I'm happy to hear that because
for him.
Let me ask you a question as it relates to this. Is it really about money as well? I've been thinking about that today. Is it the state was losing too much money when they felt like they didn't have the proper jurisdiction, or what's it really about?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, if you look at the way Governor Stitt came right out of the gate after he was elected, he immediately went after the gaming compact. He lost that fight in the courts, as he's lost every case until today. But he lost that fight, and that was, I think, about money. But it's about something that is, I think, more important in political discussions than that, and that's power. He perceives that any strengthening of tribal sovereignty automatically comes at the expense of state sovereignty. There are people in this world, and some of them hold high positions like governors of states, that see the world in this zero-sum game, that if the Indians win, well, the non-Indians lose, when the truth of the matter is, it's not that way, and it doesn't have to be that way. When tribes exercise their right to govern their own affairs, it turns out, particularly in the Cherokee experience, that everybody wins. I mean, we're a tribe that's invested in healthcare and housing and infrastructure. We've done things in rural communities that the state in some ways hasn't touched in terms of building up communities. And so it's not a zero-sum game. Sovereignty is about more than criminal justice, although that's important. It's about all aspects of governing our own affairs, and that turns out to help everyone when tribes govern themselves properly and responsibly, which we do. So I think it's more than money. I think it's about power, and I think it's about the perception that tribes ought to be in the history books. They ought not to be in the present or in the future of this country. It's still a minority view. Even though we lost in the Supreme Court today, I'm convinced that it's still a minority view that tribes ought to be wiped off the face of the earth. Unfortunately, it's the view of the governor of the state of Oklahoma.
Yes, and I was just in your headquarters. I was in your office 3 weeks
Yeah.
ago, and I had an opportunity to visit other parts of the Cherokee Nation, and you guys are doing a tremendous job. I went and visited your health clinic, and to me, it looked more like a hospital, but versus a clinic. But you guys are doing tremendous work. So I completely concur with what you just said. You guys know how to govern, and the sovereignty should stay intact. Now, what are you telling your citizens today, though? What's your message going forward?
Well, the message that we've been sending is, look, we have to acknowledge that this is not the outcome we wanted. I mean, we clearly advocated strongly. We thought we put on a very effective case to preserve what had been longstanding precedent. So we have to acknowledge that there was a loss before the United States Supreme Court. We have to be frank with our citizens that there could be broader implications, but that it is initially a narrow decision about non-Indian defendants. But the other message is this. McGirt did not get wiped away as the governor had wanted. I mean, he went to the Supreme Court, and last December, the Supreme Court told him, no, a promise made is a promise kept. We're not going to turn back on that promise. So the thing that I think Cherokee citizens should take heart in is the fact that our reservations still exist. We still are in an era in which we can make more progress exercising tribal sovereignty. Yes, today was a setback, but it's not something that is detrimental or fatal to tribal sovereignty. Tribes are here to stay. And it's not just the Cherokee Nation. I mean, I feel it, Levi, across Indian country. Tribes are gaining strength economically and politically. That doesn't set well with some people. And yes, there's going to be setbacks, but in the long run, we're going to continue to make progress, continue to exercise our sovereignty to the benefit of our citizens. And that's what I want the Cherokee people in particular to think about. Their role in the world today and the role of their tribal government is still very strong. It's very present. That doesn't change because of this decision.
And Darren, you have the last question.
What do you foresee of this meaning to the state of Oklahoma, particularly politics and the elections?
Well, here's one thing that we haven't talked about is Oklahoma's primary elections were yesterday. Now, Governor Stitt was on the ballot. He had really token opposition, so it was no surprise that he won his primary. I mean, he's a sitting governor. Of course, he should win his primary. But here's what happened. His appointed attorney general, who went to the Supreme Court and said, break your promise to Indian country, he got beat yesterday. We had the 2nd Congressional District, which covers 2 Indian nations, the Choctaw Nation and the Cherokee Nation, in terms of its geographic reach. There was a lot of candidates, I think maybe 14, 16 candidates. The candidates who said things like McGirt's the greatest threat to Oklahomans, those really anti-Indian candidates, those that said our sovereignty was a threat, they all performed poorly yesterday. The candidates who either were silent on it or have said supportive things about tribal sovereignty, they did well. That tells me where the people are, and it doesn't surprise me. The people largely have confidence in tribes. They've seen what we've done. They're supportive of tribal sovereignty. Are they concerned about the safety of their communities? Absolutely. Do they have some anxiety over something like McGirt, which changes the way jurisdiction applies? They do, and they deserve responsible leadership and not leaders that fan the flames and say there's chaos. But I think yesterday's election results really validate the Cherokee Nation's position. I sure wish we would have won before the Supreme Court. I'm sure concerned about it, but I think the people of the state of Oklahoma are with us. I think Kevin Stitt and his ilk are on the wrong side of history, and I think we'll move forward in that respect.
And thank you, Chief McGirt. We appreciate you coming on today at such a short notice, but the message is strong. Your message is strong. Keep doing what you're doing. And to our viewers, thank you very much for tuning into the special edition of Native Bidaské.
What